just a refresher here, there are four major types of tissue: epithelial tissue, which is for covering, connective tissue, which is for support, nervous tissue, which is for control and communication, and muscle tissue, which is meant for movement. Now, the last of the tissues we have to cover then, you may notice, I think there's probably a lot of information running around in your mind right now, but we do only have one left to cover, and that is muscle tissue. So muscle is special. It is highly vascular, which means a great deal of blood, and it contains structures called myofilaments. And the way that it is set up allows for three different types of muscle to be present depending on what is needed at that moment. Since we do spend some time talking about muscle down the line, the microscopic anatomy of muscle and the microphysiology of muscle, I think at this point I'll just kind of point out a couple of differences between the three. So here I'm going to show you skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Let me first talk about where they're found. Skeletal muscle is found, this is your traditional muscle, your biceps muscle, your pecs, your gastrocnemius muscle. The muscles that you think of as muscles, those are skeletal muscle. We have cardiac muscle, which, as its name implies, is the muscle that is found and comprises the great bulk of the heart. The heart is like one big muscle all to itself, and it has its own special type of muscle tissue, cardiac muscle. And the third type of muscle, which is probably the one that you are least familiar with, is called smooth muscle. It happens to be found all over your body. This is what we call an involuntary muscle. It is controlled by a different type of nervous system, which is the autonomic nervous system. So important in your body. And it's, again, because it's not as well known and it's not as well understood, it's probably the hardest one to learn about. But you'll find that we'll be talking about these muscles when we talk about digestion. You see the digestive organs there, plenty of smooth muscle in there. It also comprises the bulk of the walls of some blood vessels, and that you'll find is very important to our body's health, the way that these muscles work inside of the blood vessels. Cardiac muscle is also involuntary, of course. You do not actually have conscious control over how quickly your heart beats. And so that's also involuntary. It's sort of controlled by the autonomic nervous system, but mostly it's controlled internally. And lastly, of course, we have our skeletal muscle. This is voluntary. It's controlled by the somatic nervous system. And so we have one muscle controlled voluntarily by the somatic nervous system, and then two that are controlled involuntarily by the autonomic nervous system. One of the things to point out, just to recognize the difference between them, is that you have these structures called, it's kind of hard to miss them, these are called striations, these little stripes that go along a muscle fiber, these stripes here, those are called striations. You'll find striations both in skeletal muscle and, if you look closely, in cardiac muscle. You do not find these nice striations in smooth muscle. So there's a difference there. One of the things you'll notice about skeletal muscle is that there are many nuclei present. So all of these lined up along the side here are many nuclei. The cell itself is very, very long, very long. It can be as long as the muscle itself. So these are some of the, not the longest, but some of the longest cells in our body. And inside of there are many nuclei present. Cardiac muscle is a little bit different. They tend not to be so long. They're still pretty chunky little cells, but you will see that they are separated, that you'll see the separation between. So generally speaking, a cardiac muscle cell will have one nucleus or maybe a couple of nuclei in there. I'm not seeing a really good example here where we can see the beginning and end of one, but this is the separation between cells. So you see again, with skeletal muscle fibers, with skeletal muscle cells, there's no separation. It's just one big long cell. Cardiac muscle cells work much the same way that skeletal muscle cells work, but there's that separation. They are called intercalated discs. That's a primary differential between cardiac muscle cells and skeletal muscle cells, and they have very important point reason for being. Um, Here we have one. I think this is a cell right here. I think this is the beginning of one, and this is the end of another one. So you can kind of see one all together inside of your scope of vision. And lastly, we have our smooth muscle cells. Usually they're considered, you see that word spindle-shaped cells, which means that they are tapered off at each end and they bulge in the middle. Generally speaking, when you look at a smooth muscle cell, you don't really see that nice. I don't know. I don't usually see them looking like spindles really nicely. But anyway, that's maybe if you're really lucky, you will see a sample where you get to see actual spindle-shaped smooth muscle cells. But that's kind of what they're known for. Um, and you'll see that the nuclei tend to be kind of squished inside of there for that reason, because the cells do tend to be kind of longer and kind of stretched out.